Captain Elias Blackwater had commanded the Seven Seas for 15 years, his name whispered in equal parts fear and reverence across every port from Kingston to Tortuga. But when he met Isabella Santos in a moonlit tavern in Havana, the most feared pirate captain in the Caribbean made a choice that would haunt him forever. He gave up the seas for love. The Crimson Revenge sat anchored in the harbor like a sleeping beast, her black sails furled and her cannons silent. For 3 months now, she had remained motionless, while her captain courted the daughter of a Spanish merchant, trading his cutlass for flowers and his war cries for whispered promises of devotion. "You're making a mistake, Captain," warned his first mate, Jonas Grimm, as they stood on the dock watching Isabella's carriage disappear into the cobblestone streets of Havana. "The sea doesn't forgive those who abandon her." Elias adjusted the fine coat he now wore, instead of his weathered leather jacket, his calloused hands struggling with the delicate buttons. "The sea has given me nothing but blood and loneliness, Jonas. Isabella offers me something I've never had: peace." Jonas spat into the harbor water, his scarred face twisted with disgust. "Peace? You're the scourge of the Caribbean, the man who made the Spanish Armada flee in terror. You think you can just walk away from that life and play at being a gentleman?" "I don't think it," Elias replied firmly. "I know it. Tomorrow I marry Isabella, and we sail for her father's plantation in Cuba. I'll be a merchant, a landowner, a respectable man. And what of your crew? What of the men who followed you through hell and high water?" Elias turned to face his longtime friend, seeing the hurt and confusion in the older man's eyes. "They're free to find new ships, new captains. I've given each man his share of our last prize. They can make their own choices." But even as he spoke the words, Elias felt a strange chill run down his spine, as if the ocean itself was listening to his declaration of abandonment. The harbor water, which had been calm moments before, began to churn with an unnatural current, and the Crimson Revenge groaned against her anchor chains like a living thing in pain. "You hear that?" Jonas whispered, his face pale with superstition. "She knows, Captain. The sea knows what you're planning." Elias forced a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "It's just the tide, old friend, nothing more." The wedding took place the next morning in the Grand Cathedral of Havana, with Isabella radiant in white silk and Elias uncomfortable in his formal attire. As they exchanged vows, he tried to ignore the sound of waves crashing against the cathedral walls, strange, since the building sat well inland from the harbor. Isabella's father, Don Carlos Santos, welcomed his new son-in-law with barely concealed suspicion. The old merchant knew exactly who Elias Blackwater was, but the pirate's promise to renounce his former life and the substantial dowry he'd provided had been enough to secure the marriage. "You understand," Don Carlos said during the wedding feast, "that my daughter expects a quiet life. No more adventures, no more complications from your past." "Of course," Elias agreed, raising his wineglass. "Captain Blackwater is dead. I am simply Elias Santos now, your daughter's devoted husband." But as he spoke those words, every candle in the great hall flickered simultaneously, and the wine in his glass turned the color of blood. The other guests didn't seem to notice, but Isabella's hand tightened on his arm. "Did you see—" she began, but Elias quickly covered her hand with his own. "Just a trick of the light, my love. Nothing more." They sailed for Cuba the following week aboard Don Carlos's merchant vessel, the Santa Maria. Elias had sold the Crimson Revenge to a rival captain, though he'd refused to watch as his beloved ship changed hands. As the Cuban coastline appeared on the horizon, he felt a mixture of anticipation and loss that he couldn't quite explain. The plantation was everything Isabella had promised: sprawling fields of sugarcane, a magnificent colonial mansion, and servants who bowed respectfully to their new master. For the first time in his adult life, Elias slept in a bed that didn't rock with the motion of waves, ate meals that weren't hardtack and salt pork, and woke each morning to the sound of birds instead of creaking rigging. Isabella was radiant in her happiness. showing him every corner of their new domain with the enthusiasm of a child sharing a favorite toy. She spoke of the children they would have, the peaceful years that stretched ahead of them, the respectability that would replace his notorious reputation. "Are you happy?" she asked one evening as they walked through the plantation gardens, her hand warm in his. Elias looked down at her beautiful face, illuminated by the setting sun, and felt his heart swell with genuine affection. "More than I ever thought possible," he replied, and meant it. But that night, as Isabella slept peacefully beside him, Elias found himself drawn to the window that faced the sea. In the distance, he could see the lights of ships passing in the night, merchant vessels, naval patrols, and perhaps even pirates following the routes he had once commanded. The ocean stretched endlessly toward the horizon, dark and mysterious under the starlight. As he watched, the waves seemed to form patterns that looked almost like words, like messages written in foam and moonlight. The wind carried sounds that might have been voices calling his name, or perhaps just the cry of seabirds. "You cannot escape what you are," the waves seemed to whisper. "The sea remembers its own." Elias shook his head, forcing himself to turn away from the window. It was just his imagination, the natural melancholy of a man adjusting to a completely different life. In time, these feelings would fade, and he would become the peaceful landowner that Isabella deserved. But the ocean had other plans. The first sign came 3 weeks later, when a merchant ship arrived at the plantation's private dock with supplies from Havana. The captain, a nervous man named Rodriguez, sought out Elias immediately upon landing. "Señor Santos," he said, his voice trembling with barely controlled fear, "I bring news from the capital. There have been incidents." "What kind of incidents?" Elias asked, though something in his chest had already begun to tighten with dread. "Ships, señor. Merchant vessels have been disappearing along the routes that is, along the old pirate routes. But these aren't normal attacks. The ships are found days later, floating empty with no sign of their crews. No blood, no signs of struggle, just empty." Isabella, who had been arranging flowers nearby, looked up with concern. "Pirates? That's what we thought at first," Rodriguez continued. "But the cargo is never touched. Gold, silver, precious goods, all left exactly as it was. It's as if something took only the men, leaving everything else behind." Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening breeze. "Have there been any survivors? Anyone who might have seen what happened?" "Only one, señor. A cabin boy from the merchant vessel San Miguel. He was found floating on a piece of wreckage, half mad with terror. He keeps saying the same thing over and over. The sea came for them. The sea came for them all." That night Elias couldn't sleep. He paced the plantation house like a caged animal, his mind racing with possibilities and fears. Isabella watched him with growing concern, her happiness beginning to crack under the weight of his obvious distress. "What's wrong?" she finally asked. "You've been different since that captain brought his news. Surely these incidents have nothing to do with us." Elias wanted to reassure her, to lie and say that everything would be fine. But deep in his heart, he knew the truth. The ocean was calling in its debt, and his peaceful new life was about to be shattered. "I need to go to Havana," he said finally. "I need to investigate these disappearances." "Why?" Isabella's voice was sharp with sudden fear. "You're not a pirate anymore, Elias. You're a landowner, a respectable man. These maritime troubles are not your concern." But even as she spoke, they both heard it, the sound of waves crashing against the plantation's foundations, though the house sat nearly a mile inland. The sound grew louder and more insistent, as if the ocean itself was demanding Elias's attention. "The sea never forgets," he whispered, remembering Jonas's warning. "And it never forgives." The next morning brought news that made Elias's blood run cold. A messenger arrived at dawn with word that the Santa Isabella, the very ship that had brought them to Cuba, had been found floating empty just outside Havana harbor. Don Carlos and his entire crew had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their clothes and a ship that reeked of brine and seaweed. Isabella collapsed when she heard the news, her sobs echoing through the plantation house like the cries of lost souls. Elias held her as she wept for her father, but his mind was already racing ahead to the terrible implications. The ocean was taking everyone connected to his new life, one by one. First the random merchant ships, then Isabella's father. It was systematically destroying everything that anchored him to the land. Soon it would come for Isabella herself, and then for him. "I have to stop this," he told her as she clung to him, her tears soaking through his shirt. "I have to find out what's happening and put an end to it." "No," she whispered fiercely. "I won't lose you too. Promise me you won't go back to that life, Elias. Promise me you'll stay here where it's safe." Die. But safety was an illusion, and they both knew it. The ocean had marked them, and there was nowhere on earth they could hide from its reach. That night, as Isabella finally fell into an exhausted sleep, Elias made his way to the plantation's dock. The small harbor was empty except for a single fishing boat, but as he stood on the wooden planks, he could feel the presence of something vast and patient beneath the dark water. "What do you want?" he called out to the waves, feeling foolish but desperate. "I gave up the sea willingly. I chose a different path." The water began to churn, and slowly, impossibly, a shape began to rise from the depths. It was the Crimson Revenge, his old ship, but changed in ways that made his heart race with terror. Her hull was covered in barnacles and seaweed, her sails hung in tatters, and her deck was crowded with figures that might once have been men. At the ship's wheel stood Jonas Grimm, but his first mate's face was pale as death, his eyes black as the deepest ocean trenches. When he spoke, his voice carried the sound of drowning men and crushing depths. "You cannot abandon the sea, Captain," Jonas said, his words echoing across the water like a funeral dirge. "The ocean gave you power, wealth, and purpose. Now it demands payment for your betrayal." "I never betrayed anyone," Elias protested, though his voice shook with fear. "I simply chose love over violence, peace over chaos." "You chose to forget your true nature," Jonas replied. "But the sea remembers what you are, Elias Blackwater. You are the scourge of the Caribbean, the terror of the Spanish Main. You belong to the ocean, and it will have you back." The ghostly ship began to fade, but Jonas's final words carried clearly across the water. "3 days, Captain. In 3 days, when the moon is dark, we will come for what is ours. You can return willingly, or we will take everything you love and drag you back to the depths." As the Crimson Revenge disappeared beneath the waves, Elias fell to his knees on the dock, his mind reeling with the implications of what he had witnessed. The ocean had indeed come to collect its debt, and the price would be everything he held dear. He had 3 days to find a way to save Isabella and break the curse that bound him to the sea. 3 days to discover if love could truly conquer the ancient power of the ocean's call. But as he stumbled back toward the plantation house, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that his fate had been sealed the moment he first set foot on a ship's deck. The sea never forgot its own, and it never let them go. The next 2 days passed like a waking nightmare. Elias threw himself into research, scouring every book in Don Carlos's extensive library for information about sea curses, maritime legends, and ways to break supernatural bonds. Isabella watched him with growing alarm as he became increasingly frantic, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep and his hands shaking from too much coffee and too little food. "Tell me what's happening," she pleaded on the second evening, finding him surrounded by ancient texts and maritime charts. "Ever since my father disappeared, you've been like a man possessed. What aren't you telling me?" Elias looked up from a crumbling tome about Caribbean folklore, his face haggard with exhaustion and fear. How could he explain that her father's death was just the beginning? That ghostly ships sailed the waters around their home, and that in less than 24 hours supernatural forces would come to claim them both? "There are things about my past," he began carefully. "Things I never told you. The sea, it doesn't easily release those who have served it long and faithfully." Isabella's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "You're talking about curses, supernatural nonsense." Is it nonsense when ships disappear without a trace? When men vanish from locked cabins, leaving only the smell of brine behind? Ilias stood and moved to the window, staring out at the moonlit ocean. I commanded those waters for 15 years, Isabella. I took hundreds of ships, killed thousands of men, and claimed treasures beyond counting. The sea gave me power, and now it wants payment for my betrayal. Betrayal? Isabella's voice rose with indignation. Choosing love over violence is not betrayal. It's growth, maturity, wisdom. Tell that to the ocean, Ilias replied bitterly. Tomorrow night, when the moon goes dark, they will come for me. And if I refuse to return to my old life, he turned to face her, his eyes filled with anguish. They will take you instead. Isabella was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of his words. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but determined. Then we fight. Fight? Ilias almost laughed at the absurdity of it. How do you fight the ocean itself? How do you battle ghosts and curses and the accumulated weight of 15 years' worth of maritime sins? The same way people have always fought impossible odds, Isabella replied, moving to stand beside him. With courage, intelligence and love. You said the sea gave you power, but where did that power originally come from? Ilias frowned, thinking back to his early days as a pirate. I don't know. I was just a common sailor who mutinied against a cruel captain. Somehow, I found myself commanding men twice my age and experience. There must have been something, Isabella insisted. Some moment when you first felt the ocean's call, some artifact or ritual or the compass, Ilias interrupted, his eyes widening with sudden realization. There was an ancient compass I took from a Spanish treasure ship during my first year as captain. It always pointed toward the richest prizes, the weakest targets. I thought it was just exceptionally well made, but it was magical, Isabella finished. A focus for the ocean's power. Do you still have it? Ilias shook his head. I sold it along with everything else when I decided to leave that life behind. A collector in Port Royal bought it for an enormous sum. Then we get it back, Isabella said simply. If the compass was the source of your bond with the sea, then perhaps it can also be the key to breaking that bond. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only hope they had. As dawn broke over the plantation, Ilias and Isabella prepared for what might be their final journey together. They would sail to Port Royal, retrieve the compass, and somehow use it to sever Ilias's connection to the ocean before the dark moon rose. The voyage to Port Royal aboard a chartered merchant vessel was tense and fraught with supernatural signs. Dolphins followed their ship in patterns that spelled out warnings in ancient maritime code. Seabirds circled overhead, their cries forming words in languages that predated human civilization. The very waves seemed to whisper threats and promises, trying to lure Ilias back to his former life. The sea knows what we're planning, he told Isabella, as they stood at the ship's rail, watching the unnatural phenomena around them. It's trying to stop us. Let it try, Isabella replied fiercely. I didn't marry a coward, and I won't lose my husband to some ancient maritime tantrum. Port Royal was exactly as Ilias remembered it, a den of pirates, smugglers, and merchants who dealt in goods both legal and otherwise. The collector who had purchased his compass was a man named Aldrich Blackthorne, a wealthy antiquarian who specialized in maritime artifacts with unusual properties. Blackthorne's mansion sat on a hill overlooking the harbor, its walls lined with treasures from around the world. When Ilias and Isabella arrived, they found the collector in his study, examining what appeared to be a mermaid scale through a jeweler's loop. Captain Blackwater, Blackthorne said without looking up. I wondered when you would come for your compass. You knew I would return for it. Of course, items of power always call to their original owners, especially when those owners are in desperate need. Blackthorne finally looked up, his pale eyes gleaming with intelligence and avarice. The question is, what are you willing to pay to get it back? Ilias had brought a substantial sum of money, but Blackthorne waved away his offer dismissively. I don't want your gold, Captain. I want something far more valuable. A story. Tell me exactly why you need the compass, and I will consider returning it." With time running short and few alternatives, Elias told Blackthorne everything. The collector listened with rapt attention, occasionally asking questions about specific details of the supernatural encounters. When the tale was finished, Blackthorne sat back in his chair with a satisfied smile. "Fascinating," he murmured. "A classic case of maritime binding, complicated by the subject's attempt to break free through an act of love. The ocean doesn't appreciate such defiance." "Can the compass help us?" Isabella asked urgently. "Perhaps," Blackthorne replied. "The compass was indeed the focus of your husband's power, but it's more than just a tool. It's a contract written in brass and magnetism. The ocean granted him dominion over its surface in exchange for eternal service. Breaking that contract will require more than simply destroying the compass." "What will it require?" Elias demanded. Blackthorne stood and moved to a locked cabinet from which he withdrew a familiar object. The compass looked exactly as Elias remembered it, an ornate brass instrument with strange symbols etched around its rim and a needle that seemed to move with a life of its own. "It will require a willing sacrifice," Blackthorne explained. "Someone must take your place in the ocean's service, or the sea must be given something of equal value to what it's losing." "I'll do it," Isabella said immediately. "I'll take his place." "No!" Elias grabbed her hands, his voice fierce with desperation. "I won't let you sacrifice yourself for my mistakes." "Then what?" Isabella asked. "What could possibly be of equal value to the ocean as 15 years of pirate service?" Blackthorne smiled mysteriously. "Knowledge, my dear. The sea values knowledge above all else. The locations of sunken treasures, the secrets of lost civilizations, the true names of sea monsters. Your husband has accumulated a vast store of maritime knowledge during his years as a pirate. If he were to transfer all of that knowledge to the ocean permanently, it might accept that as payment for his freedom." "What would that mean?" Elias asked suspiciously. "You would lose all memory of your life at sea," Blackthorne explained. "Every battle, every treasure, every moment of your pirate career would be erased from your mind. You would become, in essence, the man Isabella fell in love with, someone with no connection to the ocean's power. It was a terrible choice. But as the sun began to set and the dark moon approached, it seemed like their only option." Elias looked at Isabella, seeing the love and determination in her eyes, and made his decision. "How do we do it?" The ritual had to be performed at the water's edge, with the compass serving as a conduit between Elias and the ocean's consciousness. As midnight approached and the moon disappeared behind clouds, they made their way to a secluded beach outside Port Royal. Blackthorne had provided them with the necessary components: salt from the Dead Sea, water from the deepest ocean trenches, and words of power in a language that predated human speech. As Elias began the ritual, the very air around them seemed to thicken with supernatural energy. "I offer my knowledge in exchange for my freedom," he declared, holding the compass above his head. "Take my memories of the sea, but leave me my love." The ocean responded immediately. Waves crashed against the shore with unnatural force, and the water began to glow with an eerie phosphorescence. From the depths rose the ghostly form of the Crimson Revenge, with Jonas and the spectral crew watching from her deck. "You would give up everything that made you great?" Jonas called across the water. "Your reputation, your achievements, your very identity as the scourge of the Caribbean." "Yes," Elias replied without hesitation. "For her, I would give up everything." The compass in his hands began to spin wildly, its needle pointing in all directions at once. Memories flashed through his mind: his first ship, his first battle, the treasure of Puerto Bello, the siege of Cartagena. And then, one by one, they began to fade. But as the ritual reached its climax, something went wrong. The ocean, it seemed, was not satisfied with just his memories. It wanted more. It wanted Isabella as well, as punishment for helping him escape his fate. Spectral hands reached up from the waves, grasping for Isabella as she stood beside him on the beach. Elias tried to protect her, but his connection to the sea's power was already severing, leaving him helpless against the supernatural assault. "You cannot have her!" he shouted, throwing himself between Isabella and the grasping spirits. "Our bargain was for my freedom, not her life." "The bargain," Jonas's ghostly voice replied, "was incomplete. The ocean demands a life for a life, a soul for a soul. If you will not serve, then she must take your place." In that moment of desperation, Elias made the ultimate sacrifice. Instead of completing the ritual that would erase his memories, he reversed it, offering himself completely to the ocean's service in exchange for Isabella's safety. "Take me," he declared, crushing the compass in his hands. "Take me willingly, but let her live free of this curse." The ocean accepted his offer with a roar of triumph that shook the very foundations of the earth. Elias felt the sea's power rushing back into him, stronger than ever before, but this time it came with chains that could never be broken. As the spectral ship solidified and Jonas extended a hand to help him aboard, Elias turned to Isabella one last time. "Remember me as the man who loved you," he said, his voice already beginning to echo with the sound of distant waves. "Not as the monster I'm about to become." Isabella reached for him, tears streaming down her face, but her hands passed through his form as if he were made of mist and memory. The ocean had claimed him completely, transforming him into something between man and myth, forever bound to serve the sea's will. The crimson revenge began to fade back into the supernatural realm, carrying Elias away from everything he had hoped to build with Isabella. But as the ship disappeared beneath the waves, he heard her voice calling across the water, "I will find a way to free you. I swear by all that's holy I will find a way." Years passed, and the legend of Captain Blackwater grew even darker than before. Ships spoke of a ghostly pirate who appeared during the worst storms, sometimes to save drowning sailors, sometimes to drag them down to the depths. The ocean had its servant back, but it had gained something else as well, a reminder that even the most binding curses could be challenged by love. And somewhere in a mansion overlooking the Caribbean, Isabella Santos continued her research, searching ancient texts and consulting with mystics, determined to find a way to break the chains that bound her husband to the sea. The ocean never forgot its debts, but it had learned something new. That love, too, had a memory that could span eternity.